And firstly, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians and owners of the lands and waters on which we all stand today, and pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging. And of course, that's particularly relevant in this Reconciliation Week. Welcome to the Harbour Trust DigiTalk platform. The Harbour Trust is offering a series of these presentations each Wednesday, so please have a look at harbourtrust.gov.au to check out our future presentations. Before introducing our speaker, Michael, I'd just like to give a couple of hints about our Zoom webinar today. As you can see, Michael is sharing his screen with us and your microphones have been muted. You should also be able to see a couple of video tiles. If you'd like to minimise those tiles, please go to the top and you'll see one line which you can tick to minimise the videos so you can see the presentation better. Now, if you do have any technical difficulties throughout, please use the chat function at the bottom of your screen and we'll try and help you. And Michael will be happy to answer some questions at the end of the presentation. So if you do have any questions, please use the Q&A function, again at the bottom of your screen. Please keep your questions brief, and I apologise in advance if we won't be able to get to all of them. Now to our Trust Talk presentation. Michael Bennett is a Sydney-based historian specialising in native title, oral history and Aboriginal genealogy. He recently worked in communications for the New South Wales Aboriginal Land Council. Michael's passion for tracker history developed when growing up in Dubbo and hearing stories about local trackers such as Alec Riley. His book, Pathfinders, A History of Aboriginal Trackers in New South Wales, was recently published by NewSouth Books. Aboriginal trackers were an indispensable cog in the New South Wales justice system from 1862 to 1973. Both men and women were employed by the police to perform a variety of tasks, from pursuing and arresting bushrangers, solving murders and finding lost souls in the bush. Thousands performed with distinction, although only a few gained the recognition they deserved. In this talk, Michael will retell the life stories of several trackers, including Billy Bogan, who survived a poisoning attempt at Warren in the 1880s, Mayella, a superb female tracker from Grosvenor, and Alec Riley, the doyen of New South Wales trackers from Dubbo. And Michael will let listeners in on a few secret stories from Sydney, where surprisingly trackers were employed until the 1950s. And now I'll hand over to Michael.
Catherine, thank you so much for that introduction. I'd certainly like to echo your acknowledgement of country in this particularly important week, Reconciliation Week, not just for the Aboriginal communities, but for all community members as well. So I'd really like to also thank the Sydney Harbour Federation Trust for the opportunity to come and speak about this historical passion of mine, Aboriginal trackers in New South Wales. So I'm going to travel around the state, hope to give you a little snapshot of how trackers worked, the work they did, and some of the lives and some of the difficulties and tragedies they suffered, but some of their great successes as well. Something that's really important to acknowledge, I think, during Reconciliation Week is the resilience of Aboriginal people throughout Australia and New South Wales as well, managing to survive colonialism and find a place. And that's something that trackers did, find a place, for their families to be able to survive in very, very challenging and very difficult times. So some of you might be asking, what is a tracker? What type of work did they do? So in the work they did for the police, what they used was basically traditional skills. Tracking skills were originally part of the food quest for all Aboriginal people. You had to be able to follow the tracks of animals to be able to get your food. You need to be able to identify the footprints of other people who might be from neighbouring groups who were in your area unannounced. So they were those traditional skills that were passed down from soon as Aboriginal kids were born. And there's numerous accounts of trackers saying, look, that they were taught to track from almost the moment they could walk, that the elders would sit the kids down and draw little kangaroo footprints or human footprints in the sand. And from that very early age, Aboriginal kids would begin to absorb that knowledge. It was very holistic knowledge as well. It wasn't just learning to recognize tracks. It was learning to recognize also how animals and people disturb the natural environment as they walk through it as well. And good trackers were able to pick up on those sort of minute changes and little things out of place. It might just be a broken twig or a broken leaf. But they were then able to recognize that a person or an animal had passed through. So it was those skills that that trackers brought to their work with the police force. My particular area that I've really been interested in is from 1862 onwards. And that was when the current New South Wales Police Force was formed. Trackers had been employed before then, but they were to be an important part of New South Wales Police right through until 1973, until relatively recently, when Norman Walford was the last tracker at Walgett, I should say, retired back in 1973. So, but as I said before, they were employed from before then, right back to the early history of Sydney Cove. So hopefully you're now seeing a phenomenal painting of early Sydney Cove by the artist George Evans, and it comes from 1803. Of course, look, the early interactions between Eora people and the convicts and the First Fleet were, extraordinarily difficult. Aboriginal people quite quickly withdrew from the British settlement at Sydney Cove, and didn't start to interact really until after the devastating smallpox epidemic. It was a very difficult history. Of course, Governor Phillip ordered several Aboriginal people to be kidnapped. A story which many of you will be familiar with. So for much of the 1780s, 1790s, Aboriginal people were largely staying away and keeping away from European settlement. That gradually changed, and the settlers began to realise that local Eora people had extraordinary knowledge of the environment, and were particularly useful in catching escaped convicts and pursuing thieves as well. There's a story I relate in the book in Pathfinders from 1809, and it relates to the rocks in Sydney, and you can see part of that scene depicted in the general area depicted in the painting, and including some of the Aboriginal people who were by that time living in and around Sydney Cove and the Sydney community. There was a robbery from a haberdashery store, and no one knew exactly what had become of the stolen goods, but they knew that the thieves had fled towards the rocks. So they engaged a couple of local Aboriginal men who managed to follow the signs through the rocks, follow the tracks, and then discover where that hidden haberdashery was wedged in between some rocks. So, and there are other similar cases from that early colonial period of the authorities relying on that Aboriginal knowledge to help solve crimes. Of course, it's a very difficult history as well. Another aspect of Australian history that some of you might be aware of is the use of native police. So the native police were first formed in Victoria down in the 1840s, and then in northern New South Wales and up into Queensland from about 1850 onwards. So they were a corps made up entirely of Aboriginal men with a white commander, and they had really a specific purpose, and that was subdue, to disperse, and in many cases kill Aboriginal groups. And it's a very sad history. The native police were certainly making use of those tracking skills. And there's a lot of important work that's being done now, particularly in Queensland, but elsewhere as well, looking at the history of the native police. But the area I've looked at is again a little bit later. It's after frontier warfare has ended. So Pathfinders is a little bit more about that later history. But it's a difficult history as well. It's important to acknowledge that. A lot of the research I did for the book was documentary based, looking at a variety of sources. You can see here a jail record for a fellow called Billy Bogan. But there are newspaper accounts as well that I've drawn on. But it was always very important to go back and work with the Aboriginal communities and families themselves and hear their stories. Many families, of course, are proud of their tracker ancestors. and the work that they did. It's been an under-acknowledged aspect of Australian history, most definitely, New South Wales history in particular. But at the same time, that association with the police does arouse suspicions with other Aboriginal people too. So it's a complex history, and it's one that's sort of not uniformly celebrated, if you will, by all Aboriginal people. And it's most definitely a difficult history. The fellow you can see before you, this is a jail photograph of Billy Bogan. He's also known as William Bogan, William Field, Billy Bingbone as well. And as his name suggests, the best available information suggests that he came from the Bogan River out west of Dubbo, out towards Nyngan. And he was born you can sort of, in the early 1860s. And he grew up with some other Aboriginal families in and around that area. We don't really know about his parents and whether if Billy had any kids. I haven't been able to work that out. But he certainly interacted and lived with other known Aboriginal families. As a young boy, he's probably only about 12 or 13. He travelled a couple of 100 kilometres to the east, and he was working on a property called Bumbaldry, which is in Wiradjuri country over towards Cowra. Billy himself, he's sort of on that edge of Wiradjuri and Yempa country, so it's quite possible that he spoke both those languages. We're not clearly sure. But yeah, by the early 1870s, he was working on Bumbaldry, and he was doing, I think, a variety of work there, labouring work, stock work. He may have been sort of rounding up the sheep and cattle on horses, we're not really sure. But he ran into a few problems early on. There was a bit of a misunderstanding. It was thought that he and another Aboriginal fellow that he knew, a similarly aged boy called Stephen Field, had stolen a horse, which I don't think they had, but they were nevertheless brought before the court for that. And Billy, look, he was a bit of a cheeky fella as well. I think he ran into a problem with the overseer, and the overseer threatened to, he was going to whip Billy. He said, Billy, you stop being cheeky, and he locked him in a room and then went to get a whip. So he's going to, this is terrible. He was going to attack Billy. So the overseer came into the room, but then grasped at his chest and then dropped dead from a heart attack right in front of Billy. So you can only sort of imagine how traumatic that must have been for the young fella. No blame was attached to him for the death of the overseer, but it was still a traumatic event for him to have to endure. Jump forward about another 10 years, and by this stage, Billy has taken up the job as the tracker out at Warren. So Warren's on the Macquarie River, sort of halfway between Dubbo and Nyngan, approximately. And Billy's, look, he's a good tracker, and he helps capture this local white fellow called Charles Robinson. Now, Charles Robinson had a bit of a criminal history, not the most upstanding citizen, most definitely, as we'll find out. He'd stolen some fodder from the back of the police station, which is perhaps not the most sensible thing you would think about doing anyway. But Billy had been brought on board and had tracked Charles Robinson and helped lead to his arrest. Charles was put out on bail, and look, he was due to appear in court and to face the charge. And it looked as though if he got convicted, he was going to go away. He was going to serve a few years in jail. So he devised this terrible plan. He called Billy like the day before he was meant to appear in court and said, "Oh, Billy, look, I know you've helped arrest me, but let's be friends. Why don't we go off and have a drink?" So Billy Bogan's going, this is odd. His suspicions were raised. So he says, "Yeah, look, Charles, but not right now. Let's meet up later." So they do meet up later, but Billy's also organised for the local sergeant to secrete himself at the meeting place to watch the proceedings as they unfold. And anyway, so Charles Robinson turns up and hands a drink to Billy, and Billy sort of looks at it. It's a bit cloudy, and he's going, this looks a bit suspicious. So he calls over the sergeant who's hiding and said, "Look, Charles Robinson just handed me this drink." So the sergeant's suspicious as well. They send the drink off to Sydney for testing, and turns out it's laced with strychnine. So what Robinson was going to do, he was going to poison Billy Bogan, who was going to give evidence against him in court. So that sort of goes to show what type of person Charles Robinson was. He was convicted not only of stealing that fodder, but of attempted murder, and ended up serving a long period in jail. Billy, and you can understand this, has decided, well, look, the life of a tracker is not for me, and he resigns and goes off to seek other work. And look, it's particularly towards the beginning of the 1890s. It's a recession era in colonial New South Wales, and it's a difficult time for anybody to survive, but particularly Aboriginal men and women who found it hard to get work. So Billy falls into some petty crimes. He ends up back over towards Cowra, and he commits a few robberies, and he's arrested, goes to court in Cowra, and is convicted, popped on the train to go off to Bathurst jail, like to serve a 6-month stretch. He's manacled to another prisoner who's just been convicted as well for the train journey from Cowra to Bathurst. And as the train slows down towards Carcourt, you can actually still see this today. The old train tunnel at Carcourt. It's not an active rail line anymore, but you can see the tunnel. So that as the train slows down, Billy and this other prisoner, this is 1895, decide to overpower the guard, and they push him over, they grab the key, and then they leap from the train, they unmanacle themselves and go off on their separate directions. The other prisoner, he's pretty quickly captured, but Billy goes on the run, and he heads, not surprisingly, to begin with, out towards his traditional country. So he skirts around Mount Canobolas, that big mountain that's not far from Orange. It's hard to say, but he heads out towards the Bogan River, where eventually then he takes a right turn and then travels north. And there's not many accounts of how he supported himself. It's possible that he actually went shearing on some properties up towards Angledool around the time when he was on the run, but he eventually found himself up in Charleville. So he was on the run for over a year, escaping the authorities. He was eventually arrested up there. Some Queensland trackers and the police arrested him in a property not far from Charleville, which is, I think, a couple of 100 kilometres over the Queensland border. And he's brought back. It was interesting, he gave an account afterwards, because there were lots of other trackers who were living in that area at that time who might have been asked to pursue him. But he said that particularly when he was in New South Wales and travelling up that Bogan River, he never felt that he never feared the trackers. Because he was related to them, and this is culturally, he was culturally related to them. And he gives these accounts of being up a tree and seeing the police and the trackers, passing underneath. So, and this was a common situation for trackers. They had that divided loyalty when they were being asked to pursue their own countrymen and countrywomen. What do they do? And particularly in this instance, the trackers seemingly have led the police the other way to let Billy Bogan go through. Different story by the time he was up in Charleville in 1896. He had no sort of direct cultural affiliation with the mobs up there. So he ended up being arrested. But it paints an interesting picture about generally about how trackers, with that divided loyalty. There's another story from Walgett in about the late 1870s with a tracker called Jackie Bunda, who actually did track his brother-in-law, and that's quite a close cultural relationship. He led the police to his brother-in-law, who was wanted, and his brother-in-law was arrested. And a couple of days later, some of the local Gamilaroi men attacked Jackie Bunda for retribution. So again, the message was out there that trackers, when they were faced with that situation, and it's a complex story, had to make that decision. And in some cases, they went with their employers. Others, they maintained that their loyalty to their culture. Just to finish off the Billy Bogan story, and it's a sad ending. So Billy was convicted of escaping lawful custody at Bathurst, and he was sent down to Bathurst to Parramatta Jail. He'd actually served a stretch in there before. But he sadly got ill a few years later and died. So I don't know, with the skills that he had, you can see that maybe his life could have been different if certain things had gone his way. And I think back to that poisoning attempt. If Charles Robinson hadn't tried to poison Billy Bogan, then I think Billy Bogan could have had a long and successful career with the police. But look, it wasn't to be. And but it's still important to be able to acknowledge his story and his incredible skills. in writing the book, and this was particularly having discussions with the publishers over at NewSouth, and I've really got to thank Philippa McGuinness for encouraging me to do this type of research, because I'd really been focusing on male trackers, and it's certainly the case that the records indicate that the vast majority of trackers who were employed by New South Wales post 1862 were men. But look, if you look hard enough, there is evidence to show that Aboriginal women were occasionally employed as trackers as well. And look, and certainly they had the skills. There can be no doubt about that at all. Particularly in the colonial era, it was quite often the women, the senior women, who were the repositories of knowledge, and they were passing those traditions and skills on to the next generation. So there's no doubt that they had the skills. And there's this story that's told in an early police history published in about 1910 of an Aboriginal woman out around the Brewarrina district called Mayella. So the photograph you can see before you is the Brewarrina fish traps. I don't know if any of you have been out to Brewarrina before, but it's an extraordinary sight. These intricate stone traps that were used to catch fish and feed the local Nyamba people, and neighbouring groups too would come in for feasting as well. I took this photograph in about October last year, and to really see the impact of the drought. There's barely any water amongst the fish traps. I'm happy to report that it seems it has improved a little bit since, that there has been more water flowing over the weir, which is just upstream, up to the right of Brewarrina. So the river's looking a little bit more healthy. But you can sort of see in the background, you can sort of see those ironbark trees and some of the other trees along the banks. And there's this case that is related in this police history. It would have probably occurred in the late 1800s. And there was a family, they'd gone for a picnic near Brewarrina by the Barwon River, and they were picnicking, but one of the little boys wanders off and gets lost. So it's one of these classic tracking cases. None of the local police are having any success, but they call in Mayella, a local Aboriginal woman, and she rides in on a horse and picks up the tracks straight away. No one else has seen anything, but she sees the tracks. And at one point, it looks as though she's stumped. She gets off the horse. She sort of gets down on the ground, and she's just minutely observing the environment, the landscape. And then she picks up the tracks again, and follows them. And eventually, the boy is found and he's saved. So she performed tremendous work, and she saved that boy's life. Of course, there are many other similar stories from around New South Wales and Australia. But why this one is important is that it's actually recognition that that Aboriginal women had these skills as well. What's I guess a complicated nature of any research, historical research. This is particularly the case for Aboriginal historical research too, is trying to find out more about the individuals. And some cases you can piece it together from, I mentioned some of these sources before, newspaper accounts and police histories and church records and things. And Mayella was proving a little bit elusive, but there's another better documented Aboriginal woman who was originally actually from Coopers Creek in South Australia, but lived much of her life in New South Wales, including around the Brewarrina and Burke area. And her name is Kitty Mallia, and she was around the right age, so I can't be sure, but I half think that Kitty Mallia was Mayella, because you can see that similarity in the names, but quite often in history you can never be completely sure. Anyway, Kitty Mallia was a phenomenal woman in her own right. She and her husband lived for many years in a tiny hamlet up north of Burke called Yantabulla. And she lived just in a camp on the edge of the village with other Aboriginal families. And Kitty was she was a teacher. She was a knowledge holder, and she would teach a lot of the kids tracking skills. And at the end of the year, she would conduct a test like kids have at school today. And she would test the environmental knowledge, that tracking knowledge of the kids, to see whether they could pass on to the next level. So that knowledge proved to be quite important. Kitty eventually passed away, and then some of her family moved from Yantabulla down to Brewarrina, to the Brewarrina mission, which is upstream from the picture you can see here, about 10 kilometres. And look, in the 1930s, when this story took place. It was a pretty brutal place. It was an Aboriginal station, so it had a white manager, and some of those white managers could rule just like dictators, really. You couldn't come and go as you please. You had to submit your house to inspections. There was always the danger of kids being removed. But the members of the Mayella family had decided, look, we're going to move to Warren Mission because it was, the Great Depression. There wasn't a lot of work, and they thought at least we can get some food and rations. So they moved to Warren Mission, but they found it pretty restrictive. There was terrible things going on. There was senior men who were being beaten by the authorities. It was not a good time. So the Mayallas decided they would leave, but you couldn't just walk out the gate, as I said, and permission wasn't going to be given for them to leave. So they decided to leave in the dead of night. So they had a horse and cart. They cut a hole in the fence and left and headed up towards Ingonia, and then after that they were going to go on to Yarnabulla again. So the parents said, look, we'll travel in the horse and cart along the main roads, and they had to be careful because the word could have been sent out to the police, who would have been on the lookout for them. And if they got caught with the kids, and there was every chance then the kids would be removed and sent to Kinchela Boys' Home or Cootamundra Girls' Home. So what the parents said was that we'll stick to the main road, but kids, you travel a couple of kilometres parallel to the main road, but just go through the bush. And so that's what the kids did for over 100 kilometres. And look, I think the reason why they were able to survive, they were taught all these bush skills, including tracking skills, by Kitty Mayella. She was handing that knowledge on, and that knowledge came in, it became so incredibly important for them to be able to escape the authorities and to go on and live a life that had a little bit better prospects for them. So it's a phenomenal story, and it really highlights the knowledge of Aboriginal women and their importance in passing that knowledge on to future generations. And look, I might add, I sort of know that's still happening today in New South Wales, that senior Aboriginal women, there are many knowledge holders who are passing that knowledge on right through to the current time. Okay, now, Tracker Riley. So as Catherine was saying in her introduction, this is how I sort of became interested in Aboriginal history generally, and particularly trackers in particular. So I was growing up in Dubbo in the 1980s. And, at the school and playing sport around town, I knew a lot of Aboriginal kids, a big Aboriginal population in Dubbo, but not really learning much about the local Aboriginal history. Although I do remember some of my grandparents at times mentioning tracker Alec Riley. I think that sort of planted a seed in my mind, and I started to think, oh, what sort of work did trackers do? Who was Tracker Riley? I'd love to learn more. And unfortunately, eventually I got the opportunity to find out more. Jump forward, about 20 years, and one of the first native title claims that I worked on back in the early 2000s was the Tabagal Wiradjuri claim. So Tabagal Wiradjuri, some of the local clans there from Dubbo, and I was conducting historical research for their claim, and lo and behold, I got them to meet quite a few members of the Riley family and learn more about Tracker Riley. Tracker Riley himself wasn't from Dubbo; he was a Wiradjuri man, but his family came from the Lachlan River. And then in the late 1800s, Tracker Riley was born, I think, about 1884, there or thereabouts. And in the 1890s, his parents and his siblings moved initially to Wellington, which is about 50 kilometres southeast of Dubbo. And then Tracker Riley ended up moving to Dubbo. And he was the tracker at Dubbo for almost 40 years, from 1911 up to 1950. Although he did take, he had a few missing years around the time of World War I when he wasn't employed by the police. And I thought, well, maybe he'd enrolled for World War I, as a lot of Aboriginal men did. There's over 1,000 Aboriginal men now across Australia who fought in World War I. And I thought, oh, look, maybe Tracker Riley did too, but doesn't seem to have been the case. But Tracker Riley had a phenomenal career. He's perhaps the best documented, and I guess in my opinion, the most highly regarded tracker And there's many reasons for that. I think he was an astute observer, not just of tracks, but of people as well. And he also had from what I can tell and speaking to people and reading accounts, that he was also very, very calm and patient, and very deliberate and very thorough in the work that he did. There's this one case from just after the end of World War I think it's around 1919, 1920, and a little girl has gone missing in the Muckwarra Ranges, which are just near Stewarttown on the sort of like the southern side of Wellington. And no one can find this little girl, and they call him Track OReilly, so he has to travel about 70 k's to get to the site. And he has to. It highlights just the various roles that trackers had. He had to sort of perform crowd control as well, because naturally all the residents of Stewarttown are very keen to see that the little girl is found. So he has to sort of say, look, keep back, because he didn't want anybody rushing ahead and disturbing the tracks. So he had to, on one hand, keep the townspeople behind him, but then follow the tracks as well. And he finds the little girl, but he's always thinking ahead. He had a little bottle of milk in his pocket as well, so he could give the girl, as soon as she was found, he could give that to her and, help aid her recovery, settle her down a bit after what must have been a pretty traumatic experience. Track OReilly, as many other trackers too, had to deal with quite a few traumatic experiences himself. Look, aside from pursuing criminals and finding people lost in the bush, another one of his roles was recovering bodies of drowning victims as well. He was a very good swimmer. He was very good in the water and on boats. So the police would send him out, with grappling hooks, and he would have to drag the river to look for bodies. And there's plenty of other trackers who had to do this work as well. Wyman McLean from down in Wagga, at pretty much the same time, the similar time to Track OReilly, was doing that type of work as well. So and I talk a bit about this in the book, that at the time, like, mental health wasn't really a concern for the most part, but trackers must have had to endure this a lot of stress, and this potential trauma as well. I remember another time in the late 1920s, Track OReilly was called to recover the body of another local Aboriginal fellow who it's quite likely that Track OReilly knew quite well, and he had to recover the body and bring it back, and maybe even then go and tell the family as well. So it was, difficult times. Trackers had to be resilient enough to be able to cope with this type of work, and certainly it wasn't for everyone. I think it's hard to tell. There must have been over 1,000 Aboriginal men and women post 1862 who worked as trackers. Some of them worked for 40 years, 50 years in some cases. Others seemingly only lasted a couple of months. They found that the work wasn't for them. So particularly for trackers like Track OReilly, Tracker Frank Williams from out at Burke, who worked for 40 years, Tracker Robinson from up in Lismore too, with very long careers, you can just do nothing but admire their resilience as well. Perhaps one of the best known cases that Track OReilly is known for relates to a serial killing that took place in and around Dubbo in the late 1930s. Sort of growing up in Dubbo at the time, you don't sort of know all this history, and you start to think, sort of the area where I grew up has such a troubled past. But look, it's important to get stuck into these stories. So Track OReilly was called in to investigate the murder of three sort of itinerant workers. It's the late Depression, so there are a lot of people travelling throughout New South Wales looking for work. They're not staying in the town; they're camped on reserves at the edge of town. And word started to filter through in Dubbo in the late 1930s about 3 men who'd gone missing, and suspicion fell on this another itinerant worker whose name was Moss. He became sort of known as Mad Mossy. So Track OReilly's job was to, not so much, everyone sort of knew where Mossy was, where Moss was. So Track OReilly didn't have to pursue him as such, but he had to collect the evidence that was going to be used to build the case to show that Moss was responsible for these murders. So he would follow the ruts left by Moss's cart in the ground as he moved around the camps in and around Dubbo. And then he helped to to identify the particular campsites, and then in some cases actually sift through the soil and find the burnt remains of Moss's victims. He was dispatching them and then burning them as well. It's all sort of terribly gruesome. But Tracker Riley played such an important role in pulling all this evidence together that eventually led to Moss's conviction. He was also admired. Another reason why the police particularly admired Tracker Riley was his calm demeanour in court. He was called into court to give evidence, and he would just stick to the facts, tell the story. He must have had to endure cross-examination as well, but he was a hard person to ruffle. So that's another reason to admire him as well. So look, Tracker Riley, he worked right through to 1950. He was given, he was the first tracker promoted to the rank of sergeant as a tracker. He received other state level awards as well. And you can see that phenomenal picture from the Dubbo Macquarie Original Library in the centre there of him in his uniform with the 3 sergeant stripes. But it's a difficult ending to his career, because it sort of turned out that he wasn't really a police employee, as it turns out. So he retired in 1950, and there was a farewell function, and he got a gold watch, the classic sort of retirement gift. And they passed the hat around at his farewell function and raised about £50. And Tracker Riley made a short speech, and he was very grateful for that. But not unreasonably, he expected to get a police pension, after all the work that he'd done. But the police said, no, look, sorry, you're not actually a full-time proper police employee, so you don't qualify for the pension. So Tracker Riley, he wasn't going to take this lying down. He went to his local member of parliament and said, look, this seems a bit unfair. I've just done all this work and I'm being told I don't get a police pension. And the local politician, he went down to Sydney, raised it in Macquarie Street, and the Premier looked into it. But as it turned out, that was the official police rules. Trackers weren't regarded as full-time professional police employees, therefore weren't deserving of a pension. They hadn't contributed to the fund, or the seemingly were never given the opportunity. So it's a sad ending to his career that after all that work, that he wasn't going to be so supported by the police via a pension in his retirement years. So he had to go and find out some other labouring work. He was living on the local Aboriginal reserve, Talbragar Aboriginal Reserve, about 5 kilometres to the north of Dubbo. So he had a nice little cottage out there, and he lived with his wife, Ethel, and he had the grandkids around. So I think he enjoyed his time out there. He didn't want to move into Dubbo. There's this one quote from him saying he couldn't stand the rat race of Dubbo, which sort of, I don't know, I find it sort of a little bit, from my perspective, a bit ironic. Growing up in Dubbo in the 1980s, it all seemed pretty quiet. But anyway, look, obviously Tracker Riley was used to the quiet life out on the reserve, and he eventually passed away in 1970. He was given a police procession, a proper funeral. It was covered in the press as well. So he certainly was respected in that length. But unfortunately, he didn't get a pension, which is sad, but it's just a sign of the times, unfortunately. Now, look, to end, I'm going to come back to Sydney. I said I was going to talk a little bit more at Sydney. I talked about that haberdashery robbery down in the rocks back in 1809, but there certainly were plenty of other Aboriginal men and women in and around Sydney who had tracking skills. So I might just draw your attention to the lady who's seated there in the front of this group. This is taken down in the southern part of Sydney towards like Port Hacking, Botany Bay, that sort of area. Her name's Biddy Giles. So she's a phenomenal woman, born in the first half of the 1800s. She had a number of husbands, including an Englishman named Billy Giles. And Biddy and Billy, they used to run tours for Sydney residents. This is not for the Aboriginal community, just for the broader community. And Biddy would take them fishing, and she would take them hunting. This is like through the 1860s into the 1870s, as far as can be determined. And she knew the country down as far south as the Shoalhaven River. So she had these incredible fishing, hunting, and tracking skills. There's this one story that she's going through the forests that lead in towards Royal National Park, approximately, and one of her customers has lost his pocket watch. They're traveling along, and suddenly goes, "Oh my gosh, I've lost my watch. I want my watch back." So Biddy goes, "Okay." Well, so she retraces his steps and finds the watch in the forest. So she had, these phenomenal skills. So you can see that Biddy Giles, a little bit like Mayella and Kitty Malia, had that knowledge and was passing it on to the next generation. She never formally worked for the police as a tracker, but she undoubtedly had those skills. And I think the police were missing out. They could perhaps solve more murders, found more people lost in the bush if they'd called more regularly upon Aboriginal women to do some tracking. So the history of tracking in Sydney goes right through to the 1950s. The fellow that you can see before you here is Isaac Grosvenor, and he worked from the 1920s through to about 1950 at the horse barracks, the police barracks in Redfern. I've worked in Redfern for many years, so I've taken a few walks around, and those police barracks are still there today. And you can be just walking through Redfern, and you'll see police on horseback, just walking through the street. So Isaac Grosvenor, he was expert tracker. He comes from around the Yass area, Brungle, that sort of country, to on the other side of Canberra, Ngunnawal, Wiradjuri country, in and around there. So he and a couple of his brothers had worked as trackers at Brungle and at Yass in the early parts of the 1900s. He was an expert, but he was an expert horseman, and certainly lots of trackers were. A lot of trackers had grown up with their traditional families on pastoral stations, so they'd started learning pastoral skills, such as looking after sheep, riding horses, rounding up cattle from a very young age. And one of Isaac's great skills was also horse breaking. And this was another job that a lot of trackers did throughout New South Wales, that they were responsible for looking after the police horses. A lot of trackers slept in the police stables. Sometimes they built a little hut for them out the back of the police station, often not, and they end up sleeping in the stables. But a lot of trackers loved horses, and Isaac Grosvenor was no exception. So he was transferred down to the Redfern barracks in the 1920s, and continued to work there right through to his retirement in the early 1950s. And this is a fantastic photograph. It's part of the collection now that's held at the State Library. I've got to thank Ronald Briggs, the Indigenous Service librarian, who just sent this to me recently. There's about 6 or 7, I think, photographs of Isaac Grosvenor. And you can sort of see he's such a serious looking fellow. He was obviously very dedicated to looking after these horses. And he's a contemporary of Tracker Riley. Imagine that they must have met on different occasions. Sometimes Tracker Riley would be coming down to Sydney to give evidence in court cases. Excuse me. So you can imagine that they must have met up at different times and swapped tracking stories. And look, who knows? They might have been a little bit competitive as well, trying to work out who was the best at their craft. And it's interesting. Like after Tracker Riley got an award, a few weeks later in the press, Isaac Grosvenor gets a very similar award. So maybe he was sort of agitating. I deserve that recognition as well, and he certainly did deserve that recognition. He wasn't really doing all the tracking work in and around Sydney. I haven't come across stories yet of him pursuing thieves and criminals. And of course, Sydney by the second half of the first half of the 1900s is a little bit different. It's much more of an urban landscape, and tracking skills don't translate quite so well to that urban landscape. But he certainly was responsible for looking after the police horses, and he did such a fantastic job. And look, again, when he passed away too, he was given a big police funeral and prominent coverage in the press as well. I don't really go into Isaac's story so much in in Pathfinders in my book, but it's certainly a growing story. I'm looking forward to speaking with some more of his descendants and perhaps and learning more about his phenomenal career as well. So look, as I sort of get towards the end of my talk, look, as I mentioned before, Pathfinders, published by NewSouth Books, came out in March this year. I still haven't had a formal launch, unfortunately. It was all set, but then all the COVID restrictions came in and had to put that on ice. But nevertheless, the book is certainly out there, and I encourage you, if you would like to learn more about trackers, to grab yourself a copy. Look, it's available online. You can pick up copies from Amazon and Booktopia, but I certainly encourage you to support all your local independent bookstores too. I live quite close, not too far from Novella, which is a fantastic bookstore. I'm a big fan of Abby's bookstores in the city, Glee Books too. They've been great. So there's plenty of places where you can pick up a copy, should you so like. I'd love to sign you a copy, but maybe not. We'll have to wait till we all get to the other side. But look, I'd just like to say thank you again for the Sydney Harbour Federation Trust for the opportunity to speak today, to Catherine as well. It's been great talking to you. It's a little bit unusual sitting here talking straight into my laptop, but nonetheless, I've enjoyed it. And hopefully I've given you a greater sense of the complicated and fascinating history of Aboriginal trackers in New South Wales. And I'm certainly happy to answer any questions that some of you might have texted in as well.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Michael. That was really fascinating, and we do have some questions here, so we'll be able to get to some of them, I hope. One question is, how old were those children who walked over 100 kilometres?
Yeah, that's good. They were pretty young. They're around the age of 10. Some of them were even younger, so down towards the age of 5. So it's a really phenomenal story that that those children were able to survive. They had the skills. They were, at night time, how difficult it was for them. That they could see the campfire of their parents in the distance, but they couldn't really go across to see them because they had to maintain that distance. A bit like today, they had to maintain the distance to survive, as we do as well. But yeah, so they were very young, but they still had that knowledge, which is really, really incredible.
Okay. Do you know if the army employs or uses trackers to help train soldiers?
Yeah, look, that's a really interesting question as well. Certainly, there were trackers who I think I mentioned during the talk, who who fought in wars. As far back as the Boer War, there's Tracker Bond, who was taken over, and there's also stories that trackers were taken over, but then weren't able to get back into the country too. Formal training, I have read up in the Territory, I think during World War II, that Aboriginal men with those tracking skills were brought into the army and passed some of that knowledge on. Whether that's happening today, I'm not so sure. But it's interesting. A lot of trackers excelled when they were when they were working in their traditional landscape, in their traditional lands, because they'd grown up in that country and they knew that landscape so well. But nevertheless, the skills that they learned were transferable to different environments. So you can imagine that the army could have benefited, I think, from drawing on that knowledge at different times and passing it on.
Now, Michael, have you learned any tracking skills yourself?
That's a good question. Look, I would say, look, yes, in some ways. Through the native title work that I've done, I've travelled a lot throughout New South Wales and worked with a lot of different Aboriginal communities. And I remember this one case. So I was up north of Grafton, up towards Tabulum in Bundjalung country, and there was a native title claim that I was working on, and I was with a colleague of mine, Aboriginal fellow from the mid north coast, and then one of the traditional owners as well. And they suddenly, I don't know, they sort of stopped the car and they got out, and they'd seen like a sign that there was a goanna in the bush, and they were suddenly going to start to track it, because the communities throughout New South Wales, they still have their traditional food. So if they get the opportunity, they weren't successful on this occasion, but just to see how they just divided up and sort of observed the tracks and then moved around to try and to catch that goanna. that was, I don't know, I was observing that. You wouldn't want me out in the bush generally, I would say.
Okay.
I don't think the police could draw on my own particular skills, but I guess, you know, just by reading, you get a sense of the phenomenal breadth of skills that trackers had. And that's what I really appreciate.
And just time for one final question, I think. Were the trackers the first Aboriginal people to use horses? Do you know?
Ah, that's a good question. Look, I think probably, possibly. It's hard to tell. There's probably not enough information to pin it down. But look, you can see it's interesting. In New South Wales, a lot of frontier warfare ends around the 1850s, and that's around the time of the gold rush. And I remember Heather Goodalls was first making these points back quite some time ago, the historian. And what she noticed was that what happened was that a lot of the white workers in the pastoral industry went off to the gold fields to look, you know, seek their fortune. So, and that meant the attitude of the pastoralists changed. Whereas from before, they were thinking more about driving Aboriginal people out. They suddenly needed a labour supply, so they were more happy to welcome them in. And it's particularly from that point that you start to see a lot of Aboriginal men and women associated with horses, and certainly some of them went on to be trackers. But it was happening before there. I remember looking into some of the Aboriginal history to the south of Sydney, at the Shoalhaven River, at Mount Coolangatta there, the Berry estate. And he was given that land. That land was taken away from the Shoalhaven peoples in about early 1820s. But Berry kept a lot of the community on there, and he employed hundreds of Aboriginal men and women, including ones who became, you know, very good stockmen and stockwomen and were great horse riders. And that's from the 1820s, 1830s onwards. So,
okay. Oh, good. And we just might have time for one more. Okay. Whether you know how well the trackers were paid compared to the regular police.
Yeah, that's a good question. One of the sources that I first found that alerted me to the extent of employment of trackers was called the Police Salary Register. So it was like one feature of the 1862 force was that it covered in all of New South Wales. Beforehand, there were like localised police forces, but the 1862 force that was created had a centralised bureaucracy, so they started to keep records, including a salary register. And they actually had separate pages for trackers, and it would outline, you know, what they were paid each week. And you can safely say it's clear that trackers were paid less than the lowest probationary constable. And that's always been the case, that they were on that bottom rung, which, you know, for their expertise, and they were experts in their field. And that was why the police were employing them. The police said, particularly in the 1860s and 1870s, a lot of the police were from England and Scotland and Ireland. They just had trouble going and camping out in the bush, let alone learning to follow tracks. They relied on those experts, and they weren't properly paid. They were paid the lowest out of all the police.
Okay. Well, thank you, Michael. That's about all the time we've got today, but I must say we've had some lovely comments about your presentation, that people have really learned something new today. So thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. And thank you, everybody, for coming to our presentation today. If you have any feedback, please feel free to let us know at info@harbourtrust.gov.au. And also, as I mentioned, we have more presentations to come. So please go to harbourtrust.gov.au for presentations over the next several Wednesdays, and more to come after that. So thank you everyone for coming, and we will say goodbye. Thank you. Thank you.